Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read-aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Exploration Dreamland. If you would like to recommend a text, please email us at explorationdreamland, all one word, @gmail.com. The first season of this podcast is dedicated to the memory of my friend, Ed Sears. He was a runner, coach, science enthusiast, and science fiction aficionado who was often gently encouraging of my crazy ideas. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes. Snuggle into your sleeping space and listen to tonight's tale. Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton, originally published in 1960. Chapter 11, The Witch. There were patches of light in the inner valley marking the phosphorescent plants, some creeping at ground level, others tall as saplings. On other nights, Shan had welcomed that wan radiance, but now he lay in as relaxed a position as possible, marking each of those potential betrayers as he tried to counterfeit the attitude of sleep and at the same time plan out his route. He had purposely settled in a pool of shadow, the wolverines beside him, and he thought that the bulk of the animals' bodies would cover his own withdrawal when the time came to move. One arm lying limply across his middle was in reality clutching to him an intricate arrangement of small hide straps which he had made by sacrificing most of the remainder of his painfully acquired thongs. The trap must be set in place soon. Now that he had charted a path to the crucial point, avoiding all light plants, Shan was ready to move. The Terran pressed his hand on Taggy's head in the one imperative command the wolverine was apt to obey, the order to stay where he was. Shan sat up and gave the same voiceless instruction to Togi. Then he inched out of the hollow, a worm's progress to that narrow way along the cliff top, the path which anyone or anything coming up from that sea gate on the beach would have to pass in order to witness the shoreline occupied by the half-built outrigger. So much of his plan was based upon luck and guesses, but those were all Shan had. And as he worked at the stretching of his snare, the Terran's heart pounded, and he tensed at every sound out of the night. Having tested all the anchoring of his net, he tugged at a last knot, and then crouched to listen, not only with his ears, but with all his strength of mind and body. Pound of waves, whistle of wind, the sleepy complaint of some bird, a regular splashing. One of the fish in the lagoon? Or what he awaited? The Terran retreated as noiselessly as he had come, heading for the hollow where he had bedded down. He reached there, breathless, his heart pumping, his mouth dry as if he had been racing. Taggy stirred and thrust a nose inquiringly against Shan's arm, but the wolverine made no sound, as if he too realized that some menace lay beyond the rim of the valley. Would that other come up the path Shan had trapped? Or had he been wrong? Was the enemy already stalking him from the other beach? The grip of his stunner was slippery in his damp hand. He hated this waiting. The canoe. His work on it had been a careless botching. Better to have the job done right. Why, it was perfectly clear now how he had been mistaken. His whole work plan was wrong. He could see the right way of doing things laid out as clear as a blueprint in his mind. A picture in his mind. Shan stood up and both wolverines moved uneasily, though neither made a sound. A picture in his mind, but this time he wasn't asleep. He wasn't dreaming a dream to be used for his own defeat. Only that other could not know this. The pressure which had planted the idea of new work to be done in his mind, an idea one part of him accepted as fact, had not taken warning from his move. He was supposed to be under control. The Terran was sure of that. All right, so he would play that part. He must, if he would entice the trapper into his trap. He holstered his stunner, walked out into the open, paying no heed now to the patches of light through which he must pass on his way to the path his own feet had already worn to the boat beach. As he went, Shan tried to counterfeit what he believed would be the gait of a man under compulsion. Now he was on the rim fronting the downslope, fighting against his desire to turn and see for himself if anything had climbed behind. The canoe was all wrong, a bad job which he must make better at once so that in the morning he would be free of this island prison. The pressure of that other's will grew stronger, and the Terran read into that the overconfidence which he believed would be part of the enemy's character. The one who was sending him to destroy his own work had no suspicion that the victim was not entirely malleable, ready to be used as he himself would use a knife or a force axe. Shan strode steadily downslope. With a small spurt of fear, he knew that in a way that unseen other was right. The pressure was taking over, even though he was awake this time. The Terran tried to will his hand to his stunner, but his fingers fell instead on the hilt of his knife. He drew the blade as panic seethed in his head, chilling him from within. He had underestimated the other's power. And that panic flared into open fight, making him forget his careful plans. Now he must wrench free from this control. The knife was moving to slash a hide lashing directed by his hand, but not his will. A soundless gasp, a flash of dismay rocked him, but neither was his gasp nor his dismay. That pressure snapped off. He was free. But the other wasn't. Knife still in his fist, Shan turned and ran upslope, his torch in his other hand. He could see a shape now writhing, fighting, outlined against a light bush. And fearing that the stranger might win free and disappear, the Terran spotlighted the captive in the beam, reckless of throg or enemy reinforcements. The other crouched, plainly startled by the sudden burst of light. Shan stopped abruptly. He had not really built up any mental picture of what he had expected to find in his snare, but this prisoner was as weirdly alien to him as a throg. The light on the torch was reflected off a skin which glittered as if scaled, glittered with the brilliance of jewels in bands and coils of color, spreading from the throat down the chest, spiraling about upper arms, around waist and thighs, as if the stranger wore a treasure house of gems as part of a living body. Except for those patterned loops, coils, and bands, the body had no clothing, though a belt about the slender middle supported a pair of pouches and some odd implements held in loops. Roughly, the figure was more humanoid than the Throg's. The upper limbs were not too unlike Shan's arms, though the hands had 4 digits of equal length instead of 5. But the features were non-human, closer to saurian in contour. It had large eyes, blazing yellow in the dazzle of the flash, with vertical slits of green for pupils, a nose united with the jaw to make a snout, and above the domed forehead a sharp V-point of raised spiky growth extended back and down until behind the shoulder blades it widened and expanded to resemble a pair of wings. The captive no longer struggled, but sat quietly in the tangle of the snare Shan had set, watching the Terran steadily as if there were no difficulty in seeing through the brilliance of the beam to the man who held it. And, oddly enough, Shan experienced no repulsion toward its reptilian appearance as he had upon first sighting the beetle Throg. On impulse, he put down his torch on a rock and walked into the light to face squarely the thing out of the sea. Still eyeing Shan, the captive raised one limb and gave an absent-minded tug to the belt it wore. Shan, noting that gesture, was struck by a wild surmise, leading him to study the prisoner more narrowly. Allowing for the alien structure of bone, the non-human skin, this creature was delicate, graceful, in its way beautiful, with a fragility of limb which backed up his suspicions. Moved by no pressure from the other, but by his own will and sense of fitness, Shan stooped to cut the control line of his snare. The captive continued to watch as Shan sheathed his blade and then held out his hand. Yellow eyes, never blinking since his initial appearance, regarded him, not with any trace of fear or dismay, but with a calm measurement which was curiosity based upon a strong belief in its own superiority. He did not know how he knew, but Shan was certain that the creature out of the sea was still entirely confident, that it made no fight because it did not conceive of any possible danger from him. And again, oddly enough, he was not irritated by this unconscious arrogance. Rather, he was intrigued and amused. Friends? Shan used the basic galactic speech devised by Survey and the Free Traders, semantics which depended upon the proper inflection of voice and tone to project meaning when the words were foreign. The other made no sound, and the Terran began to wonder if his captive had any audible form of speech. He withdrew a step or two, then pulled at the snare, drawing the cords away from the creature's slender ankles. Rolling the thongs into a ball, he tossed the crude net back over his shoulder. "Friends?" he repeated again, showing his empty hands, trying to give that one word the proper inflection, hoping the other could read his peaceful intent in his features, if not by his speech. In one lithe, flowing movement, the alien arose. Fully erect, the Warlockian had a frail appearance. Shan, for his breed, was not tall, but the native was still smaller, not more than 5 feet, that stiff V of head crest just topping Shan's shoulder. Whether any of those fittings at its belt could be a weapon, the Terran had no way of telling. However, the other made no move to draw any of them. Instead, one of the 4-digit hands came up. Shan felt the feather touch of strange fingertips on his chin, across his lips, up his cheek, to at last press firmly on his forehead at a spot just between the eyebrows. What followed was communication of a sort, not in words or in any describable flow of thoughts. There was no feeling of enmity, at least nothing strong enough to be called that. Curiosity, yes, and then a growing doubt, not of the Terran himself, but of the other's preconceived ideas concerning him. Shan was other than the native had judged him, and the stranger was disturbed, that self-confidence a little ruffled. And also, Shan was right in his guess. He smiled, his amusement growing, not aimed at his companion on this cliff-top, but at himself. For he was dealing with a woman, a very young woman, and someone as fully feminine in her way as any human girl could be. "Friends?" he asked for the third time. But the other still exuded a wariness mixed with surprise, and the tenuous message which passed between them then astounded Shan. To this Warlockian out of the night he was not following the proper pattern of male behavior at all. He should have been in awe of the other merely because of her sex. A diffidence rather than an assumption of equality should have colored his response, judged by her standards. At first he caught a flash of anger at this preposterous attitude of his. Then her curiosity won, but there was still no reply to his question. The fingertips no longer made contact between them. Stepping back, her hands now reached for one of the pouches at her belt. Shan watched that movement carefully, and because he did not trust her too far, he whistled. Her head came up. She might be dumb, but plainly she was not deaf. And she gazed down into the hollow as the wolverines answered his summons with growls. Her profile reminded Shan of something for an instant, but it should have been golden yellow instead of silver with two jeweled patterns ringing the snout. Yes, that small plaque he had seen in the cabin of one of the ship's officers. A very old Terran legend. Dragon, the officer had named the creature. Only that one had possessed a serpent's body, a lizard's legs and wings. Shan gave a sudden start, aware his thoughts had made him careless. Or had she in some way led him into that bypath of memory for her own purposes? Because now she held some object in the curve of her curled fingers, regarding him with those unblinking yellow eyes. Eyes. Shan dimly heard the alarm cry of the wolverines. He tried to snap-draw his stunner, but it was too late. There was a haze about him hiding the rocks, the island valley with its radiant plants, the night sky, the bright beam of the torch. Now he moved through that haze as one walks through a dream approaching nightmare, striding with an effort as if wading through a deterring flood. Sound, sight, one after another those senses were taken from him. Desperately Shan held to one thing, his own sense of identity. He was Shan Lonte, Terran breed, out of Tyre, of the Survey Service. Some part of him repeated those facts with vast urgency against an almost overwhelming force which strove to defeat that awareness of self, making him nothing but a tool or a weapon for another's use. The Terran fought, soundlessly but fiercely, on a battleground which was within him, knowing in a detached way that his body obeyed another's commands. "I am Shan," he cried without audible speech. "I am myself. I have 2 hands, 2 legs. I think for myself. I am a man. and to that came an answer of sorts, a blow of will striking at his resistance, a will which struggled to drown him before ebbing, leaving behind it a faint suggestion of bewilderment, of a dawn of concern. "I am a man." He hurled that assertion as he might have thrust deep with one of the crude spears he had used against the Throgs. For against what he faced now, his weapons were as crude as spears fronting blasters. "I am Jeanne Lanté, Terran, man." Those were facts. No haze could sweep them from his mind or take away that heritage. And again there was the lightening of the pressure, the slight recoil, which could only be a prelude to another assault upon his last stronghold. He clutched his 3 facts to him as a shield, groping for others which might have afforded a weapon of rebuttal. Dreams. These Warlockians dealt in and through dreams, and the opposite of dreams are facts. His name, his breed, his sex, these were facts, and Warlock itself was a fact. The earth under his boots was a fact. The water which washed around the island was a fact. The air he breathed was a fact. Flesh, blood, bones, facts, all of them. Now he was a struggling identity imprisoned in a rebel body. But that body was real. He tried to feel it. Blood pumped from his heart. His lungs filled and emptied. He struggled to feel those processes. With a terrifying shock, the envelope which had held him vanished. Shan was choking, struggling in water. He flailed out with his arms, kicked with his legs. One hand grated painfully against stone. Hardly knowing what he did, but fighting for his life, Shan caught at that rock and drew his head out of the water. Coughing and gasping, half drowned, he was weak with the panic of his close brush with death. For a long moment he could only cling to the rock which had saved him, retching and dazed as the water washed about his body, a current tugging at his trailing legs. There was light of a sort here, patches of green which glowed with the same subdued light as the bushes of the outer world, for he was no longer under the night sky. A rock roof was but inches over his head. He must be in some cave or tunnel under the surface of the sea. Again a gust of panic shook him as he felt trapped. The water continued to pull at Shan, and in his weakened condition it was a temptation to yield to that pull. The more he fought it, the more he was exhausted. At last the Terran turned on his back, trying to float with the stream, sure he could no longer battle it. Luckily, those few inches of space above the surface of the water continued, and he had air to breathe. But the fear of that ending, of being swept under the surface, chewed at his nerves, and his bodily danger burned away the last of the spell which had held him, brought him into this place, wherever it might be. Was it only his heightened imagination, or had the current grown swifter? Shan tried to gauge the speed of his passage by the way the patches of green light slipped by. Now he turned and began to swim slowly, feeling as if his arms were leaden weights, his ribs a cage to bind his aching lungs. Another patch of light, larger, spreading across the roof overhead. Then he was out of the tunnel into a cavern so vast that its arching roof was like a sky dome far above his head. But here the patches of light were brighter, and they were arranged in odd groups which had a familiar look to them. Only better than freedom overhead, there was a shore not too distant. Shan swam for that haven, summoning up the last rags of his strength, knowing that if he could not reach it very soon, he was finished. Somehow he made it and lay gasping, his cheek resting on sand finer than any of the outer world, his fingers digging into it for purchase to drag his body on. But when he collapsed, his legs were still awash in water. No footfall could be heard on that sand, but he knew that he was no longer alone. He braced his hands and with painful effort levered up his body. Somehow he made it to his knees, but he could not stand. Instead, he half tumbled back so that he faced them from a sitting position. There were 3 of them, the dragon-headed ones with their slender, jewel-set bodies glittering even in this subdued light, their yellow eyes fastened on him with a remoteness which did not approach any human emotion, save perhaps that of a cold and limited wonder. But behind them came a 4th, one he knew by the patterns on her body. Shan clasped his hands about his knees to still the trembling of his body, and eyed them back with all the defiance he could muster. Nor did he doubt that he had been brought here, his body as captive to their will as had been that of their spy or messenger in his crude snare on the island. "Well, you have me," he said hoarsely. "Now what?" His words boomed weirdly out over the water, were echoed from the dim outer reaches of the cavern. There was no answer. They merely stood, watching him. Shan stiffened, determined to hold to his defiance and to that identity which he now knew was his weapon against the powers they used. The one who had somehow drawn him there moved at last, circling around the other 3 with a suggestion of diffidence in her manner. Shan jerked back his head as her hand stretched to touch his face, and then, guessing that she sought her peculiar form of communication, he submitted to her fingertips, though now his skin crawled under that light but firm pressure, and he shrank from the contact. There were no sensations this time. To his amazement, a concrete inquiry shaped itself in his brain, as clear as if the question had been asked aloud. "Who are you?" "Shan," he began vocally, and then turned the words into thoughts. "Shan Lonte, Terran, man." He made his answer the same which had kept him from succumbing to their complete domination. "Name, Shan Lonte. Man? Yes." The other accepted those. "Terran?" That was a question. Did these people have any notion of space travel? Could they understand the concept of another world holding intelligent beings? "I come from another world." He tried to make a clean-cut picture in his mind. A globe in space, a ship blasting free. "Look." The fingers still rested between his eyebrows, but with her other hand the Warlockian was pointing up to the dome of the cavern. Shan followed her order. He studied those patches of light which had seemed so vaguely familiar at his first sighting, studying them closely to know them for what they were. A star map, a map of the heavens as they could be seen from the outer crust of Warlock. Yes, I come from the stars, he answered, booming with his voice. The fingers dropped from his forehead. The scaled head swung around to exchange glances, which were perhaps some unheard communication with the other three. Then the hand was extended again. Come. Fingers fell from his head to his right wrist, closing there with surprising strength, and some of that strength, together with a new energy, flowed from them into him, so that he found and kept his feet as the other drew him up. Chapter 12. The Veil of Illusion. Perhaps his status was that of a prisoner, but Shan was too tired to press for an explanation. He was content to be left alone in the unusual circular but roofless room of the structure to which they had brought him. There was a thick mat-like pallet in one corner, short for the length of his body, but softer than any bed he had rested on since he had left the Terran camp before the coming of the Throgs. Above him glimmered those patches of light symbolizing the lost stars. He blinked at them until they all ran together in bands like the jeweled coils on Warlockian bodies. Then he slept dreamlessly. The Terran awoke with all his senses alert. Some silent alarm might have triggered that instant awareness of himself and his surroundings. There had been no change in the star pattern overhead. No one had entered the round chamber. Shan rolled over on his mat bed, conscious that all his aches had vanished. Just as his mind was clearly active, so did his body also respond effortlessly to his demands. He was not aware of any hunger or thirst, though a considerable length of time must have passed since he had made his mysteriously contrived exit from the outer world. In spite of the humidity of the air, his ragged garments had dried on his body. Shan got to his feet, trying to order the sorry remnants of his uniform, eager to be on the move. Though to where and for what purpose, he could not have answered. The door through which he had entered remained closed, refusing to yield to his push. Shan stepped back, eyeing the distance to the top of the partition between the roofless rooms. The walls were smooth with the gloss of a seashell's interior, but the exuberant confidence which had been with him since his awakening refused to accept such a minor obstacle. He made 2 test leaps, both times his fingers striking the wall well below the top of the partition. Shan gathered himself together as might a cat and tried the 3rd time, putting into that effort every last ounce of strength, determination, and will. He made it, though his arms jerked as the weight of his body hung from his hands. Then a scramble, a knee hooked over the top, and he was perched on the wall, able to study the rest of the building. In shape, the structure was unlike anything he had seen on his home world or reproduced in any of the Tri-D records of survey accessible to him. The rooms were either circular or oval, each separated from the next by a short passage, so that the overall impression was that of 10 strings of beads radiating from a central knot of one large chamber, all with the uniform nacre walls and a limited amount of furnishings. As he balanced on the narrow perch, Shan could sight no other movement in the nearest line of rooms, those connected by corridors with his own. He got to his feet to walk the tightrope of the upper walls toward that inner chamber which was the heart of the Warlockian palace, town. apartment dwelling? At least it was the only structure on the island, for he could see the outer rim of that smooth, soft sand ringing it about. The island itself was curiously symmetrical, a perfect oval, too perfect to be a natural outcrop of sand and rock. There was no day or night here in the cavern. The light from the roof patches remained constantly the same, and that flow was abetted within the building by a soft radiation from the walls. Shan reached the next room in line, hunkering down to see within it. To all appearances, the chamber was exactly the same as the one he had just left. There were the same unadorned walls, a thick mat bed against the far side, and no indication whether it was in use or had not been entered for days. He was on the next section of corridor wall when he caught that faint taint in the air, the very familiar scent of wolverines. Now it provided Shan with a guide as well as a promise of allies. The next bead room gave him what he wanted. Below him, Taggy and Togi paced back and forth. They had already torn to bits the sleeping mat which had been the chamber's single furnishing, and their temper was none too certain. As Shan squatted well above their range of vision, Taggy reared against the opposite wall, his claws finding no hold on the smooth coating of its surface. They were as competently imprisoned as if they had been dropped into a huge fish bowl, and they were not taking to it kindly. How had the animals been brought here? Down that water tunnel by the same unknown method he himself had been transported until that almost disastrous awakening in the center of the flood? The Terran did not doubt that the doors of the room were as securely fastened as those of his own further down the corridor. For the moment the wolverines were safe. He could not free them. And he was growing increasingly certain that if he found any of his native jailers, it would be at the center of that wheel of rooms and corridors. Shan made no attempt to attract the animals' attention, but kept on along his tightrope path. He passed 2 more rooms, both empty, both differing in no way from those he had already inspected, and then he came to the central chamber, 4 times as big as any of the rest, and with a much brighter wall light. The Terran crouched, one hand on the surface of the partition top as an additional balance, the other gripping his stunner. For some reason, his captors had not disarmed him. Perhaps they believed they had no necessity to fear his off-world weapon. "Have you grown wings?" The words formed in his brain, bringing with them a sense of calm amusement to reduce all his bold exploration to the level of a child's first staggering steps. Shan fought his first answering flare of pure irritation. To lose even a fraction of control was to open a door for them. He remained where he was as if he had never heard that question, surveying the room below with all the impassiveness he could summon. Here the walls were no smooth barrier, but honeycombed with niches in a regular pattern, and in each of the niches rested a polished skull, a non-human skull. Only the outlines of those ranked bones were familiar, for just so had looked the great purple-red rock where the wheeling flyers issued from the eye sockets. A rock island had been fashioned into a skull, by design or nature. And upon closer observation, the Terran could see that there was a difference among these ranked skulls, a mutation of coloring from row to row, a softening of outline, perhaps by the wearing of time. There was also a table of dull black, rising from the flooring on legs which were not more than a very few inches high, so that from his present perch the board appeared to rest on the pavement itself. Behind the table in a row, as shopkeepers might await a customer, 3 of the Warlockians, seated cross-legged on mats, their hands folded primly before them, and at the side a 4th, the one whom he had trapped on the island. Not one of those spiked heads rose to view him, but they knew that he was there. Perhaps they had known the very instant he had left the room or cell in which they had shut him. And they were so very sure of themselves. Once again Shan subdued a spark of anger. That same patience with its core of stubborn determination which had brought him to Warlock backed his moves now. The Terran swung down, landing lightly on his feet, facing the 3 behind the table, towering well over them as he stood erect, yet gaining no sense of satisfaction from that merely physical fact. "You have come." The words sounded as if they might be a part of some polite formula, so he replied in kind and aloud. "I have come." Without waiting for their bidding, he dropped into the same cross-legged pose, fronting them now on a more equal level across their dead black table. "And why have you come, Star Voyager?" That thought seemed to be a concentrated effort from all 3, rather than any individual questioning. "And why did you bring me?" He hesitated, trying to think of some polite form of address. Those he knew which were appropriate to their sex on other worlds seemed incongruous when applied to the bizarre figures now facing him. "Wise ones," he finally chose. Those unblinking yellow eyes conveyed no emotion. Certainly his human gaze could detect no change of expression on their non-human faces. "You are a male." "I am," he agreed, not seeing just what that fact had to do with either diplomatic fencing or his experiences of the immediate past. Where then is your thought guider?" Shan puzzled over that conception, guessed at its meaning. "I am my own thought guider," he returned stoutly, with all the conviction he could manage to put into that reply. Again he met a yellow-green stare, but he sensed a change in them. Some of their complacency had ebbed. His reply had been as a stone dropped into a quiet pool, sending ripples out afar to disturb the customary mirror surface of smooth serenity. "The Starborn One speaks the truth." That came from the Warlockian who had been his first contact. "It would appear that he does." The agreement was measured, and Shan knew that he was meant to overhear that. "It would seem, readers of the rods," the middle one of the triumvirate at the table spoke now, "that all living things do not follow our pattern of life. But that is possible. A male who thinks for himself, unguided, who dreams perhaps, or who can understand the truth of dreaming. Strange indeed must be his people. Sharers of my visions, let us consult the old ones concerning this." For the first time, one of those crested heads moved. The gaze shifted from Shan to the ranks of the skulls, pausing at one. Shan, ready for any wonder, did not betray his amazement when the ivory inhabitant of that particular niche moved, lifted from its small compartment, and drifted buoyantly through the air to settle at the right-hand corner of the table. Only when it had safely grounded did the eyes of the Warlockian move to another niche on the other side of the curving room, this time bringing up from close to floor level a time-darkened skull to occupy the left corner of the table. There was a third shifting from the weird storehouse, a last skull to place between the other two. And now the youngest native arose from her mat to bring a bowl of green crystal. One of her seniors took it in both hands, making a gesture of offering it to all three skulls, and then gazed over its rim at the Terran. "We shall cast the rods, man who thinks without a guide. Perhaps then we shall see how strong your dreams are, to be bent to your using or to break you for your impudence." Her hands swayed the bowl from side to side, and there was an answering whisper from its interior, as if the contents slid loosely there. Then one of her companions reached forward and gave a quick tap to the bottom of that container, spilling out upon the table a shower of brightly colored slivers, each an inch or so long. Shan, staring at the display in bewilderment, saw that in spite of the seeming carelessness of that toss, the small needles had spread out on the blank surface to form a design in arrangement and color, and he wondered how that skillful trick had been accomplished. All three of the Warlockians bent their heads to study the grouping of the tiny sticks, their young subordinate leaning forward also, her eagerness less well controlled than her elders. And now it was as if a curtain had fallen between the Terran and the aliens. All sense of communication which had been with him since he had entered the skull-lined chamber was summarily cut off. A hand moved, making the jeweled pattern, braceleting wrist and extending up the arm, flash subdued fire. Fingers swept the sticks back into the bowl. 4 pairs of yellow eyes raised to regard Shan once more, but the blanket of their withdrawal still held. The youngest Warlockian took the bowl from the elder who held it, stood for a long moment with it resting between her palms, fixing Shan with an unreadable stare. Then she came toward him. One of those at the table put out a restraining hand. This time Shan did not master his start as he heard the first audible voice which had not been his own. The skull at the left hand on the table, by its yellowed color the oldest of those summoned from the niches, was moving because its jaws gaped and then snapped, emitting a faint bleat which might have been a word or two. She who would have halted the young Warlockian's advance withdrew her hand. Then her fingers curled in an unmistakable beckoning gesture. Shan came to the table, but he could not quite force himself near that chattering skull, even though it had stopped its jig of speech. The bowl of sticks was offered to him. Still no message from mind to mind, but he could guess at what they wanted of him. The crystal substance was not cool to the touch as he had expected. Rather, it was warm, as living flesh might feel. And the colored sticks filled about 2/3 of the interior, lying all mixed together without any order. Shan concentrated on recalling the ceremony the Warlockian had used before the first toss. She had offered the bowl to the skulls in turn. The skulls, but he was no consulter of skulls. Still holding the bowl close to his chest, Shan looked up over the roofless walls at the star map on the roof of the cavern. There, that was Rama, and to its left, just a little above, was Tyre's system, where swung the stark world of his birth, and of which he had only few good memories, but of which he was a part. The Terran raised the bowl to that spot of light which marked Tyre's pale sun. Smiling with a wry twist, he lowered the bowl, and on impulse of pure defiance, he offered it to the skull that had chattered. Immediately he realized that the move had had an electric effect upon the aliens. Slowly at first, and then faster, he began to swing the bowl from side to side, the needles slipping, mixing within, and as he swung it, Shan held it out over the expanse of the table. The Warlockian who had given him the bowl was the one who struck it on the bottom, causing a rain of splinters. To Shan's astonishment, mixed as they had been in the container, they once more formed a pattern, and not the same pattern the Warlockians had consulted earlier. The dampening curtain between them vanished. He was in touch, mind to mind, once again. So be it. The center Warlockian spread out her four-fingered thumbless hands above the scattered needles. What is red is red. Again a formula. He caught a chorus of answer from the others. What is red is red. To the dreamer, the dream. Let the dream be known for what it is, and there is life. Let the dream encompass the dreamer falsely, and all is lost. Who can question the wisdom of the old ones? Asked their leader. We are those who read the messages they send out of their mercy. This is a strange thing they bid us do, man. Open for you our own initiate's road to the veil of illusion. That way has never been for males who dream without set purpose, and have not the ability to know true from false, have not the courage to face their dreams to the truth. Do so, if you can. There was a flash of mockery in that, combined with something else, stronger than distaste, not as strong as hatred, but certainly not friendly. She held out her hands, and Shan saw now, lying on a slowly closing palm, a disk such as the one Torvald had shown him. The Terran had only one moment of fear, and then came blackness, more absolute than the dark of any night he had ever known. Light once more, green light with an odd shimmering quality to it. The skull-lined walls were gone. There were no walls, no building held him. Shan strode forward, and his boots sank in sand, that smooth satin sand which had ringed the island in the cavern. But he was certain he was no longer on that island, even within that cavern, though far above him there was still a dome of roof. The source of the green shimmer lay to his left. Somehow he found himself reluctant to turn and face it. That would commit him to action. But Shan turned. A veil of rippling green. Material? No, rather mist or light. A veil depending from some source so far over his head that its origin was hidden in the upper gloom, a veil which was a barrier he must cross. With every nerve protesting, Shan walked forward, unable to keep back. He flung up his arm to protect his face as he marched into that stuff. It was warm, and the gas, if gas it was, left no slick of moisture on his skin in spite of its foggy consistency. And it was no veil or curtain, for although he was already well into the murk, he saw no end to it. Blindly he trudged on, unable to sight anything but the rolling billows of green, pausing now and again to go down on one knee and pat the sand underfoot, reassured at the reality of that footing. And when he met nothing menacing, Shan began to relax. His heart no longer labored. He made no move to draw the stunner or knife. Where he was and for what purpose, he had no idea. But there was a purpose in this, and that the Warlockians were behind it, he did not doubt. The initiate's road, the leader had said, and the conviction was steady in his mind that he faced some test of alien devising. A cavern with a green veil. His memory awoke. Torvald's dream. Shan paused, trying to remember how the other had described this place. So he was enacting Torvald's dream. And could the survey officer now be caught in Shan's dream in turn, climbing up somewhere into the nose slit of a skull-shaped mountain? Green fog without end, and Shan lost in it. How long had he been here? Shan tried to reckon time, the time since his coming into the water world of the starred cavern. He realized that he had not eaten, nor drank, nor desired to do so either, nor did he now. Yet he was not weak. In fact, he had never felt such tireless energy as possessed his spare body. Was this all a dream? His threatened drowning in the underground stream a nightmare? Yet there was a pattern in this, just as there had been a pattern in the needles he had spilled across the table. One even led to another with discernible logic. Because he had tossed that particular pattern, he had come here. According to the ambiguous instructions or warnings of the Warlockian witch, his safety in this place would depend upon his ability to tell true dreams from false. But how? Why? So far he had done nothing except walk through a green fog, and for all he knew, he might well be traveling in circles. Because there was nothing else to do, Shan walked on, his boots pressing sand, rising from each step with a small sucking sound. Then, as he stooped to search for some indication of a path or road which might guide him, his ears caught the slightest of noises, other small sucking whispers. He was not the only wayfarer in this place. Stay tuned for the next segment from Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter and Instagram, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find this and many other interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.